stopped?
Because you're acting nervous. ID.
I'm not nervous. I'm being delayed without cause. Am I detained? Yes or no?
You will be if you keep talking. Come with me for screening.
On what?
The boarding gate at Terminal C was already loud at 8:15 a.m. Rolling suitcases rattled across the tile floor. A tired voice echoed from the speakers announcing final boarding for Flight 328 to Chicago. The air smelled like burnt coffee and jet fuel seeping in from the open jet bridge. "Ma'am, step to the side, please." The voice came sharp, cutting through the noise. The black woman had just lifted her phone to scan her boarding pass. She paused, turned slowly, eyes steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" The airport police officer stood close. Too close. His hand hovered near his radio posture, rigid chin slightly raised. "I need to ask you a few questions before you board." Around them, passengers continued moving. No one else was stopped. No one else was questioned. The scanner beeped for the next traveler, as if nothing unusual was happening. "I'm boarding my flight," she said calmly. "You can see my pass. What's the issue?" The officer glanced at the screen, then back at her face. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he gestured again. "Step out of line. Now." The woman exhaled slowly and complied, rolling her carry-on 2 steps to the side. Her suit was tailored dark blue conservative. A leather briefcase rested against her leg. She looked like every other federal official that passed through this terminal every hour. But the officer's eyes didn't soften. "Where are you traveling today?" "Chicago. Purpose of travel. Work." "What kind of work?" She tilted her head slightly. The question lingered longer than necessary. Around them, people had started to notice. A man near the window slowed down, phone half raised. A woman whispered something to her companion. "Officer, is there a reason I'm being singled out?" she asked. The officer's jaw tightened. "I'm conducting a security check. You seem nervous." She wasn't. Her hands were steady. Her voice never rose, but the accusation hung there heavy and familiar. "I'm not nervous," she replied. "I'm being delayed without explanation." "Am I suspected of something?" The officer ignored that too. He asked for her ID. She handed over her driver's license and boarding pass. He studied them longer than necessary, flipping the card back and forth as if waiting for it to change. "This ticket yours?" he asked. "Yes." "You traveling alone?" "Yes." At this point, the line had thinned. Boarding was almost complete. A gate agent glanced over uneasy, but said nothing. The officer took a step closer. "You're going to need to come with me for additional screening." The words landed hard. Not a request, a command. "On what grounds?" she asked quietly. The officer hesitated for half a second. "Just procedure." That was the moment the tension shifted. The woman looked past him toward the jet bridge, then back into his eyes. Her expression didn't show fear or anger. It showed calculation. The kind that comes from years of navigating rooms where power is tested. "All right," she said, "but understand this. Every word from this point forward matters." The officer didn't understand yet, but he was about to. She stood there quietly while the officer turned away with her ID. The noise of the terminal faded into a low hum as the story rewound not just minutes but decades back to places no one in that boarding line could see. She had not grown up around airports. Her childhood memories were of bus stations and long drives through the night, her mother gripping the steering wheel after double shifts, her father asleep in the passenger seat before he disappeared from their lives entirely. She learned early that stability was fragile and authority was not always fair. In school, she was the quiet student who stayed late, who read case law before she understood all the words, who learned that preparation was armor. Law school did not come easily. She worked part-time, sometimes full-time, clerked during the day and studied at night. Professors noticed her discipline before they noticed her brilliance. She did not speak often in class, but when she did, the room went silent. She graduated near the top of her class, not because she was gifted, but because she was relentless. Her career in public service began where most people burn out. Federal prosecution. Long hours. Relentless pressure. Cases involving fraud, civil rights violations, and corruption that dragged on for years. She learned how power hides behind procedure and how the smallest unchecked discretion can ruin lives. She learned how to stay calm while others tried to intimidate her. She learned that the law only works when someone is willing to enforce it without fear. Years later, she rose through the Department of Justice not by playing politics, but by producing results. She led task forces that dismantled discriminatory practices, investigated abuse of authority, and rewrote policy that had quietly harmed communities for decades. She became a division chief because she understood systems, not just statutes. She flew constantly from hearing to hearing, briefing to briefing. Airports were her second office. She never asked for special treatment. In fact, she avoided it. She dressed conservatively, spoke plainly, followed rules meticulously. She knew how quickly perception could shift, especially for someone who looked like her in spaces built by and for others. The officer who stopped her did not know any of this. He had been on the force for 11 years. Airport assignment for the last 3. A position often described as quiet, predictable, low risk. His file told a different story. Multiple informal complaints. Nothing that stuck. Passengers claiming they were questioned without cause. Supervisors noting attitude issues but never enough to trigger discipline. He was described as proactive, alert, trusts his instincts. Those instincts had never cost him anything before. He had grown comfortable with the uniform, comfortable with being obeyed, comfortable with the idea that hesitation was guilt and questions were defiance. In his world, authority was rarely challenged, and when it was, it came from people who looked nothing like the woman standing at gate C-17. He saw movement out of pattern. A black woman in a tailored suit traveling alone, carrying authority without displaying it. His mind filled the gaps with assumptions he did not recognize as bias, only caution. He told himself he was doing his job. As he scanned her ID, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The need to justify the stop. To find something, anything that would make his decision feel necessary. Around him, passengers watched. Cameras recorded. The moment had witnesses now. He did not step back. He leaned in. The distance between them was no longer about security. It was about control. When he asked her to follow him, he expected compliance and relief. Instead, he got precision. Calm. A warning delivered without threat. Every word from this point forward matters. He did not hear it as advice. He heard it as challenge. What neither of them said out loud was already shaping what came next. She had spent her career holding people like him accountable when they crossed invisible lines. He had spent his avoiding consequences because those lines were rarely enforced. 2 paths had converged in a place designed for transit, not confrontation. One built on discipline, law, and restraint. The other built on assumption, authority, and habit. And only one of them understood exactly how much damage the next few minutes could cause. The officer motioned with his head and began walking toward a side corridor marked authorized personnel only. The woman followed her heels, clicking softly against the floor, her carry-on rolling behind her. Every step drew more attention. A man near the gate openly held up his phone now. Another passenger whispered, "Is she being arrested?" She wasn't. Not yet. But the air felt close, compressed by curiosity and unease. Inside the secondary screening area, the noise of the terminal dulled. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A metal table sat in the center of the room, scuffed from years of use. The officer placed her documents down with deliberate slowness, as if time itself were part of the test. "You mind telling me again where you're headed?" he asked. "Chicago," she replied. "Who are you meeting there?" "Colleagues." He looked up sharply. "Doing what?" "Working," she said. "Federal business." That word lingered. Federal. He frowned as if tasting it. "You have proof of that?" She reached into her briefcase carefully and removed a government-issued identification card. She placed it on the table, face-up, fingers resting beside it. The seal caught the light. The officer glanced at it, then pushed it back with one finger. Anyone can print one of these. The dismissal was casual, practiced. At that moment, a second officer stepped into the doorway. Younger, hesitant. He took in the scene, the card on the table, the woman's composed posture, the tension that had settled into the room. "Everything all right?" the younger officer asked. The first officer didn't look at him. "Routine screening," he said. "She's being uncooperative." The woman lifted her eyes. "I've answered every question," she said. "I've provided identification. I'm asking for the legal basis for this delay." The younger officer shifted his weight. People were starting to gather just outside the open door. A gate agent stood nearby, pretending not to stare. Phones were still recording. "Sir," the younger officer said quietly, "boarding for that flight is almost complete." The first officer straightened. "That's not my concern." He turned back to her. "You traveling with any prohibited items?" "No." "Large amounts of cash?" "No." "Why are you really flying today?" The question landed differently this time. Less procedural, more accusatory. She paused, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she recognized the moment. This was where escalation usually happened, where voices rose, where tone became evidence. She chose restraint. "I've told you why," she said evenly. "And I'm asking again." Am I being detained or am I free to go? The officer's silence stretched. He didn't like the question, didn't like being cornered by it. He glanced toward the doorway, aware now of the eyes, the cameras, the growing audience. He was too far in to retreat gracefully. You're being held for further verification, he said. Verification of what? Your identity. She nodded once slowly. Then she reached back into her briefcase and removed a second credential. This one heavier. Official. Undeniable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. She placed it beside the first. The room shifted. The younger officer leaned closer, eyes widening slightly as he read. He looked at her face again, this time with recognition forming not certainty yet but doubt, real doubt. Sir, he said again, quieter now, we should probably call this in. The first officer's jaw clenched. He felt it slipping. Control, certainty, the narrative he had built in his head since the gate. He had assumed resistance would come with fear or anger. Instead, it came with documents and questions. Outside the room, someone spoke loudly enough to be heard. She showed ID. Why is this still happening? The officer ignored it. He picked up the credential again, held it closer to his face. His confidence was thinner now, stretched tight over a mistake he hadn't admitted yet. He was still deciding whether to stop. And the woman standing across from him already knew that the crowd, the cameras, and the law were beginning to close in. The decision was made without ceremony. The officer stepped closer and gestured toward the chair against the wall. Sit there. She did not argue. She moved slowly, deliberately, and sat. The carry-on was placed at her feet. The metal chair was cold through the fabric of her suit. A clock on the wall ticked loudly. Every second felt counted. The officer spoke into his radio in a low voice. Codes, short phrases. He turned away while he did it, as if privacy could still be preserved. The younger officer stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes darting between her and the hallway outside where the crowd had grown. The door remained open. Phones were still up. No one had been told to stop recording. She folded her hands in her lap. Her face remained neutral, but inside her mind was already moving. She cataloged times, statements, actions. The moment she had been removed from the boarding line, the lack of explanation, the refusal to articulate cause. She had built cases on less. The officer returned and stood in front of her. You're being temporarily detained until we verify some information. Temporarily, she repeated. Yes. For how long? As long as it takes. The phrase was familiar, vague enough to mean nothing, dangerous enough to mean everything. She looked up at him. Am I being accused of a crime? No. Then why am I not allowed to board my flight? He didn't answer. He reached for her briefcase. I'm going to search this. No, you're not, she said calmly. He froze for half a beat. Excuse me. I do not consent to a search. You do not have probable cause, and I am not under arrest. The room went still. The younger officer inhaled sharply. Sir, he said, maybe we should wait for supervision. The first officer felt the eyes again. The cameras. The witnesses. He had meant to slow this down, but now it was accelerating without him. You're interfering with the security process, he said. She didn't raise her voice. Asserting my rights is not interference. He reached for the cuffs. The sound they made was small, metallic, final. The click echoed louder than it should have. For a moment, no one moved. Then he stepped behind her and took her wrist. The pressure was firm, unnecessary. Her shoulders stiffened not in resistance, but in recognition of what this had become. Several voices rose at once from the hallway. Why is she being handcuffed? She didn't do anything. Is this real? The officer tightened the cuffs. The metal closed around her wrists, cold against her skin. Slow motion stretched the moment. The feel of steel, the sound of ratcheting teeth, the weight of humiliation settling without warning. She stood when he pulled her up. Her posture remained straight. Her eyes stayed forward. The younger officer looked away. As they walked her down the corridor, the terminal noise returned in waves. Boarding announcements, footsteps, conversations that stopped mid-sentence as people realized what they were seeing. A woman in handcuffs, a suit, a briefcase now carried by someone else. She was escorted past the gate, past the jet bridge, past the place she should have been allowed to leave. Inside the holding room beyond security, the door closed with a hollow thud. The sound lingered in the air. The officer stood across from her, breathing heavier now. His confidence was gone, replaced by something like dread. He checked his watch, looked at the door, looked at her. She finally spoke. You should call your supervisor, she said. He didn't answer, but his silence told her everything. She leaned back slightly, cuffs resting against her knees, and stared at the blank wall ahead. In her mind, the case was already forming. Claims, violations, names, jurisdiction. He had thought this was a routine stop. It wasn't. It was the moment everything he had been protected from finally caught up with him. The door opened without a knock. A man in a dark blazer stepped inside, followed by a woman with a tablet pressed to her chest. Both wore the same airport authority badge, but their posture was different. Slower. Heavier. The kind that came from walking into a problem already halfway to disaster. "What's going on here?" the man asked. The officer spoke quickly, words slightly tangled. Passenger flagged for additional screening. Refused consent to search. Non-compliant. The supervisor didn't respond immediately. His eyes went first to the cuffs, then to her face, then to the credentials placed neatly on the table in front of her. He picked them up carefully, not flipping them, not dismissing them. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He swallowed. "You verified this?" he asked. The officer hesitated. "I was in the process." The supervisor turned to the woman. "Ma'am, can you state your name for the record?" She did, clearly, calmly. "And your position?" She paused for a fraction of a second. Then she answered. "Division Chief, United States Department of Justice." The words landed with weight. Not dramatic, not raised, but final. The room shifted instantly. The supervisor's shoulders tightened. The woman with the tablet stopped typing. Even the officer's breathing changed, shallow, now uneven. The supervisor looked back down at the credentials, this time reading every line. The seal. The issuing authority. The clearance level. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. He looked up at the officer. Why was she handcuffed? The officer opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. She was being detained pending verification. Verification of what, the supervisor asked. The officer didn't answer. The supervisor exhaled slowly through his nose. He reached behind him and quietly closed the door. "Ma'am," he said, his tone different now, measured, careful. "I'm going to have these removed immediately." He nodded to the woman with the tablet. She stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. The metal released with a soft click. Red marks were already visible on her wrists. "I'm very sorry for this situation," the supervisor said. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't stand. She looked directly at him. "Who authorized this detention?" she asked. The supervisor glanced at the officer. He did not answer. "I'd like the names and badge numbers of everyone involved," she continued. "I'd also like the timestamps for when I was removed from boarding and when I was restrained." The woman with the tablet typed quickly now. The officer's face had gone pale. The authority he'd carried minutes earlier had drained out of him completely. He stared at the floor. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're going to escort you back to the gate and ensure you're accommodated on the next available flight." "I won't be boarding today," she said. "Not like this." There was no anger in her voice, just certainty. "I want copies of all reports, body camera footage, and surveillance recordings preserved immediately. Nothing is to be altered or deleted." "Yes, ma'am," the supervisor said without hesitation. She stood now, smoothing her jacket, reclaiming her briefcase. She looked once more at the officer who had started this. He couldn't meet her eyes. As she walked out of the room, escorted now with deference instead of force, the terminal noise felt different. The crowd had thinned, but the phones were still out. The story was already moving faster than anyone in uniform could control. Behind her, the supervisor turned to the officer and spoke in a low voice sharp enough to cut. "You had no idea who you were stopping, did you?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. The damage was done. The truth was out. And what had felt like authority an hour ago now felt like a liability no one wanted to touch. By the time she left the airport, the first video had already surfaced online. A shaky clip, 30 seconds long. Her standing near the boarding gate, the officer blocking her path. His voice firm, hers controlled. The caption was simple. "Airport police stop black woman boarding flight for no reason." Within hours, there were more angles. Someone had filmed the escort. Someone else caught the cuffs. Another recorded the supervisor's arrival, the shift in posture, the moment authority changed hands. The clips stitched themselves together faster than any official statement could. By nightfall, the story had a name. By morning, it had consequences. She did not speak to the press that day. She didn't need to. Her office released a short statement confirming her identity and position. Division Chief, Department of Justice. Federal employee detained without cause at a domestic airport. Matter under review. That was all it took. Legal analysts began breaking it down frame by frame. Former prosecutors paused videos to explain why the detention was unlawful. Civil rights attorneys listed violations in plain language. Fourth Amendment. Unlawful detention. Retaliation for asserting rights. Equal protection concerns. It was all there, documented by strangers with phones. The officer was placed on administrative leave within 24 hours. His badge taken. His weapon secured. The airport authority announced an internal investigation, then quietly notified federal oversight bodies before being asked. Behind closed doors, the tone was very different. Emails flew. Risk assessments, settlement projections. Someone used the word indefensible more than once. Someone else asked why his prior complaints had never escalated. No one had a good answer. She filed her notice of claim 3 days later. The document was precise. Dates, times, names, citations. It named the officer individually, the airport police department, and supervisory failures. It referenced the videos by timestamp. It requested preservation of all digital records. There was no emotion in the filing, just facts. Public reaction was immediate and relentless. Millions of views in 48 hours. Comment sections filled with similar stories. People who had been stopped, questioned, delayed, humiliated. People who had never seen accountability until now. Hashtags trended. Advocacy groups demanded action. Lawmakers issued statements, some careful, some defensive, some apologetic. The officer's records surfaced next. 3 informal complaints in 5 years. 2 alleging racial profiling. 1 alleging escalation without cause. All resolved internally. None sustained. None escalated. The pattern had been there, quiet and ignored, until it met someone who could not be dismissed. The airport authority moved quickly after that. The officer was terminated for cause. Policy violations, failure to follow procedure, unlawful detention. The language was sterile, but the message was clear. His career in law enforcement ended with that letter. Appeals were considered, quietly discouraged. The settlement followed months later. The amount was never officially announced, but sources close to negotiations confirmed it was substantial. Enough to make headlines. Enough to ensure reforms were not optional. The agreement included mandatory bias training, revised detention protocols, and federal monitoring of airport police procedures for 3 years. She donated a portion of the settlement to civil rights organizations. She did not attend the press conference. She issued one statement. This was never about compensation. This was about correction. The officer never spoke publicly again. The videos remain online, a reminder of how quickly authority collapses when exposed to daylight. A reminder that the difference between a routine stop and a career-ending mistake is often who is on the other side of the badge, and a reminder that justice does not begin with shouting. It begins with documentation. What happened in that airport was not complicated. It only felt that way because authority often hides behind complexity. Strip it down and the facts are simple. A law enforcement officer detained a passenger without articulable suspicion. He escalated the encounter when questioned. He applied restraint without probable cause. Each of those steps crossed a clear legal line. Not a gray area, not a judgment call. A line defined by constitutional law that every officer is trained on. The Fourth Amendment does not disappear at airport gates. Security protocols allow limited screening, not open-ended detention based on instinct. Asking questions is permitted. Demanding compliance without cause is not. Once a passenger asserts their rights, that assertion cannot legally be used as justification to escalate. That is settled law. There is also the equal protection issue. When enforcement actions fall disproportionately on one group without objective criteria, bias becomes legally relevant whether or not it is admitted. Courts do not require slurs or confessions. They look at patterns, decisions, and outcomes. In this case, the pattern was visible on video. From a psychological perspective, the moment that mattered most was not the handcuffs. It was earlier. It was when the officer felt challenged. Research on authority bias shows that when identity and control are threatened, some individuals double down instead of reassessing. The uniform becomes armor. The command becomes reflex. That is how small errors become career-ending ones. For civilians, there are lessons here that apply far beyond airports. First, calm is not submission. Calm is strategy. Keeping your voice level, your movements deliberate, and your words precise protects you and preserves evidence. Second, documentation changes power dynamics. Cameras do not escalate situations. They clarify them. If you are legally allowed to record, do so. If you are a bystander, recording may be the most effective intervention you can make. Third, ask clear questions. Am I being detained or am I free to go? What is the legal basis for this action? Those questions force accountability in real time and later in court. Fourth, comply physically when necessary, but not verbally. Resistance creates risk. Silence preserves rights. You can challenge actions later. You cannot undo harm. For institutions, The lesson is harsher. Unchecked discretion erodes trust faster than any policy failure. Complaint histories matter. Training without accountability is theater. Authority without oversight is liability. This incident mattered not because of who the woman was, but because of what it revealed. She had knowledge, position, and resources, and still experienced the same initial treatment countless others describe. The difference was what happened next. Justice did not come from outrage alone. It came from process, from records, from law applied as written, not as assumed. The next person stopped at a gate may not have federal credentials. They may not have a platform. But the standard should not change based on who is watching. That is the measure of a system that works. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, remember, you do not need to be loud to be powerful. You need to be clear. You need to be documented. And you need to know that your rights exist, whether or not someone in uniform acknowledges them. What is your biggest takeaway from this story? Do you think accountability would have happened without video? Comment below and share your thoughts. Or